A plane is plummeting towards the sea. Inside the cockpit, two pilots are fighting over control of the aircraft. First Officer Rémi Emmanuel Plesel is desperately trying to pull the nose of the aircraft up in a bid to save everyone's lives. Meanwhile, Captain Iriyanto inexplicably pushes the nose of the aircraft down, accelerating their descent. Moments later, the aircraft crashes into the Java Sea, killing everyone on board. Just hours after the flight is reported missing, search and rescue teams are deployed and pieces of the wreckage are slowly pulled out of the sea. 12 days later, the black box was recovered and investigators began to unravel the tragic story of Indonesia AirAsia Flight 8501. 156 passengers boarded an AirAsia Airbus A320-200 performing a routine flight from Surabaya Airport in Indonesia to Singapore International. Boarding the plane was Mr. Choi with his 2-year-old daughter Zoe. Mr. Choi, who originates from the UK, was expecting to reunite with his wife and son who had taken an earlier flight after the family had been unable to get 4 seats together. So Mr. Choi and his daughter ended up taking the later flight. The pair sat at the front of the plane in seats 1B and 1C. Interestingly, the passengers who booked the seats next to them and therefore preventing the rest of the family from getting on the flight didn't actually show up, leaving seats 1A and 1D empty. In fact, 23 lucky people didn't show up to board the plane. Among the 23 no-shows was a family of 10. The Mahitis had slept in. They frantically rushed to the airport but only missed the flight by minutes. They thought that they had ruined their holiday. Another family won't be as lucky. Grayson Herbert's Linux Seater, aged 11, boarded the flight with his father, mother and sister. This time, the family were able to get seats next to each other. However, Grayson remained on his own, looking over the left wing of the aircraft. Manning the flight deck was Captain Iriyanto. He had logged over 20,000 hours of flight time and was described by AirAsia as an experienced airman. The captain had decided beforehand that First Officer Rémi Emmanuel Plesel, a 46-year-old French national, was to take control of the route and perform both takeoff and landing whilst Iriyanto supervised him. Captain Iriyanto briefed the First Officer of the impending thunderstorm that littered their journey to Singapore. This was crucial information for Rémi to remember, as the extreme turbulence thunderstorms can bring can very quickly turn a flight into a complete nightmare. And so the First Officer was to avoid these storms at all cost. At 5:35 AM, the flight took off on runway 10 from Surabaya Airport. As they climbed to their cruising altitude of 32,000 feet, the first problem Rémi encountered was the rapidly dropping temperature outside the aircraft that could cause an ice buildup on the engines. To counter this, Rémi turned on the engine's anti-ice systems. Suddenly, the master caution warning sounded and the ECAM displayed Auto Flight Rudder Travel Limiter System. The ECAM, or Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor, is used to monitor and display critical information about the aircraft's systems and performance. The Automatic Flight Rudder Travel Limitation System is a system that limits the travel range of the rudder during flight. This is necessary because at high speeds, using excessive rudder can be dangerous. It's like turning the steering wheel of a car 90 degrees whilst traveling down the motorway. It causes the vehicle to lose control. Immediately, Rémi performed the ECAM actions to set the flight augmentation computer, otherwise known as FAC1 and FAC2, to off and then on one by one. After he had done this, both rudder travel limiter systems returned to normal function. The master caution warning sounded once again. The ECAM displayed the same message, Auto Flight Rudder Travel Limiter System. So Rémi performed the exact same action of resetting the FAC1 and 2 computers. Despite turning to the left to avoid one pocket of extreme weather, the aircraft was now heading into another pocket. Rémi asked ATC to increase his altitude, however this time he was denied due to other traffic. Thunderstorms can create serious problems for planes flying in them. However, the biggest danger they present is turbulence. Turbulence can be life-threatening to passengers as it can cause sudden and violent movement of the aircraft, leading to injuries for those not properly secured. Now that it looks like the flight was heading straight into one, Rémi decided to turn on the seatbelt signs. The master caution sounded for the third time. The ECAM displayed the exact same message, and so Rémi performed the exact same action of resetting the FAC 1 and FAC 2 computers. It became increasingly clear to the flight deck that resetting the FACs was not working and they still had another hour to go. In fact, this same warning message had been reappearing on this aircraft for a couple of months now, but it only usually happened once a flight. Today it was appearing multiple times, and coupled with the impending turbulence, First Officer Rémi was quickly becoming overworked. Finally, Jakarta radar cleared Rémi to increase their altitude just in time to avoid the storm, but there was no reply. The ECAM message that had been plaguing the flight for the past hour appeared 2 more times, and Captain Iriyanto had had enough. Rémi was already overworked between contacting ATC, monitoring the weather radar, and monitoring the autopilot. Iriyanto was not prepared to allow Rémi to become even more distracted, turning on and off a flight's computer. Iriyanto began thinking of an alternate solution. He had seen that by resetting the FAC circuit breakers on the overhead panel and behind Rémi, it could rectify the rudder travel limiter failure. Despite this procedure not being a part of his training, Iriyanto got out of his seat and located the FAC circuit breakers. One by one, he pulled them. Almost immediately, the autopilot and auto thrust disconnected and the plane began banking to the left. The aircraft had entered alternate law. Before the circuit breakers were pulled, they were flying in normal law, which ensures full flight protections and automation, including FAC protection, the same FAC protection that had stopped the rudder from moving. Alternate law does not have these same protections, and so without the FAC computer to stop it, the rudder began deflecting 2 degrees to the left, resulting in the aircraft rolling to the left. Rémi was startled by the unusual bank angle and froze for 9 seconds. Once he snapped back into reality, he quickly rolled the aircraft to the right. The plane was more or less level, but because of how quickly Rémi rolled, he assumed that he had overcorrected and so pushed his side stick back to the left, restoring the original bank angle. For a reason unknown, Rémi also began to pull up on his side stick, causing the plane to enter a rapid climb. The plane was quickly losing speed, and Captain Iriyanto ordered Rémi to pull down. Oddly, Rémi ignored this command and continued to pull up on his side stick. Realizing he was being ignored, Iriyanto grabbed his side stick and pushed it down. Iriyanto was attempting to push the nose of the plane into the dive in order to increase the speed of the aircraft. Once the speed had been recovered, Iriyanto could then pitch the nose of the aircraft up and stop the descent without stalling. This was in fact the correct thing to do, and Iriyanto would have been able to recover the stall if not for Rémi, who was still pulling up on his side stick. On the A320, dual inputs are usually announced with a warning. However, this warning was overridden by the more important stall warning. The A320 software averages out the 2 inputs between each side stick, therefore meaning neither pilot was actually making a difference. The aircraft was neither pitching up or down, just straight and level, falling out of the sky. Passing through 10,000 feet, the chances of a successful recovery quickly diminished, as Captain Iriyanto would need to trade some altitude in exchange for speed so he could pitch the nose of the aircraft up and stop their descent. However, as long as Rémi was pulling up on his side stick, Captain Iriyanto stood no chance of saving their lives. On December 28, 2014, at 6:20 AM, Indonesia AirAsia Flight 8501 slams into the Java Sea at speeds of 219 kilometers per hour.
Hello everyone, I'm Aisha Sase. We start with the breaking news. An AirAsia flight from the Indonesian city of Surabaya is reported missing.
A woman's body, only in underwear, floating in the Java Sea. And that was it. They knew it was over. The wailing of mothers in particular began. The newly engaged couple, the biology teacher whose father and boyfriend had been loyally waiting for news, the executive and his 2-year-old daughter only taking this flight because an earlier one was full.
The first items of the wreckage were spotted by search aircraft on the 30th of December, 2 days after the flight was reported missing. Over the next 3 months, all large pieces of the fuselage would be lifted from the sea floor and moved to Indonesia for investigation. This would include the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, which would take investigators 11 months to comb through. And the flight data recorder told investigators a clear story. After the captain had pulled the fact circuit breakers, the aircraft lost many automated systems and protections. Mainly the protection that stops the rudder from moving during flight. This caused the rudder to deflect slightly to the left, causing an unusual bank angle. Investigators could then only assume that the first officer became spatially disorientated, leading to him flying erratically and pitching the nose up. The aircraft entered into a stall and fell out the sky. But this didn't make sense. An Airbus can still be flown in alternate law, and if the pilots were able to recover the stall, they could have landed in Singapore safely. Initially, investigators thought that the pilots failed to recover from the stall as they were never trained to do so. Investigators asked Airbus as to why, and Airbus stated that they assumed that pilots would never need to recover from a stall, as the A320 systems would prevent a stall from happening in the first place. But these systems were disabled when the captain pulled the circuit breakers. It's important to note that A320 pilots have never been taught to pull the fact circuit breakers mid-flight. An experienced pilot doing this was extremely unusual, and so the attention of the investigators turned to Captain Iriyanto. Captain Iriyanto was described as an experienced airman who was a F-16 fighter pilot before going into commercial aviation. The captain had more than 20,000 flying hours, of which 6,000 was with the Airbus A320. Investigators listened to the cockpit voice recorder and found that after the 5th master caution warning, Iriyanto became extremely irritated with the reappearing fault. Iriyanto told Rémi that recently he had observed a ground engineer resetting the fact circuit breakers to rectify the rudder travel limiter failure. Iriyanto assumed that he could do the same thing in the air. Clearly, he was wrong. But even after the circuit breakers were pulled, the plane was still perfectly flyable. The reason they had entered into a stall was not because of the captain, but because of the first officer. Investigators then turned to First Officer Rémi Emmanuel Plesel. The first officer's mother stated that Rémi had always wanted to be a pilot ever since he was a child. He would telephone her every time he took a flight. One day before this accident, Rémi video called his mother to see his family's Christmas decorations. He was looking forward to going home. Investigators could only explain Rémi's actions with the theory that after realizing the hard left bank angle, Rémi pushed his side stick to the right to correct the angle, but the excessive roll sensation to the right caused what's known as spatial disorientation. And so Rémi tried to overcorrect what he thought was an overcorrection by pulling his side stick to the left and up, which caused the aircraft to pitch up and roll left. Investigators moved on to the cockpit voice recording. As they listened to the CVR, they heard that as the aircraft lost speed, Iriyanto told Rémi to pull down. Investigators found this command to be confusing, as the side stick can either be pushed down or pulled up. Due to the aircraft stalling and losing altitude, Rémi, who was also confused by Iriyanto's order, decided to continue pulling his side stick up in a reflexive effort to increase altitude. The flight data recorder then showed Iriyanto activating his side stick after realizing Rémi wasn't doing as he was told. Iriyanto did the correct thing by pushing his side stick down in an attempt to increase airflow over the wings and generate lift. However, investigators found that Iriyanto failed to alert Rémi that he was taking over control, and Iriyanto failed to push his side stick takeover button for more than 30 seconds. Instead, he was pushing the button in short intervals. This led to a dual input. Both side sticks were being averaged out by the A320's computer, leading to both pilots having no effects on their situation. As for the ECAM message, investigators found that a small crack in a solder joint within a flight's computer resulted in the occasional loss of electricity, therefore causing the ECAM to display the failure message. Ultimately, the cause of this crash was pilot's error and miscommunication. It was also completely preventable. Investigators calculated that there was about 3 minutes between the circuit breaker pull and the plane hitting the sea. Questions still remain as to how 2 experienced pilots failed to communicate with each other for the 3 most critical minutes of their lives. The official search ended on the 17th of March 2015, 79 days after the plane went missing. 116 bodies had been recovered, leaving 46 bodies unaccounted for. Also of these 46 unfound bodies was Grayson's mother and his 12-year-old sister. Grayson and his father, the only 2 surviving family members, were buried next to each other on the 2nd of January 2015. Mr. Choi was recovered and brought back to the UK. However, his 2-year-old daughter Zoe would never be found.